This corner of the studio needs some change. The sofa bed is no longer used as a sofa, and I need more horizontal storage. A new desk with big drawers. Let's start by making the tabletop. So, the scrapwood saga is progressing. I decided to put myself on the mission of using as much cheap wood from my wood library shelves as possible, so I mainly chose soft pine and most of the remaining valchromat strips that were thick enough to use for this tabletop. I almost emptied this soft pine shelf, which felt pretty good. I managed to repurpose a bunch of wood from old projects. Some of these pieces were stored for 8 or even 10 years. For example, this extremely bowed piece of pine came from a sculpture project I made back in 2011 when I was a senior at Fine Arts. I cut it in half to reduce the bow and jointed two faces until they were straight. Instead of using the thickness planer, I made light passes on the table saw to create a parallel face and straighten up other pieces. I wanted this cleaning job to be relatively quick, and my priority here was to give up on perfection. My main exercise with this project was to accept that things don't always need to be perfectly straight, gapless, or visually pristine. I still offered resistance throughout the whole process, but knowing that this project was for myself and the studio, not for a client or my apartment, it was easier to accept all the imperfections. I used a thin plywood sheet with just 1 centimeter as a support panel for the strips and traced the diagonal line for the cutout near the glass door. When I build the bottom cabinet, you'll better understand why this tabletop is not a rectangle. Keep an eye open for the follow-up video. I took some time selecting scraps and laying them out in a relatively random pattern until the entire width of the plywood board was filled. The wood scraps are not long enough to meet the length of the table, so I trimmed them square to make nicer connections. I glued and clamped the first strip that will serve as a reference. It wasn't the best option to start from the smaller side. I wasn't paying attention because it obviously would make much more sense to start with the longest line and build a strip pattern from there. It wasn't the end of the world, but doing it the way I did made it more complicated to clamp the shorter ends. I glued 5 to 6 lines at a time and waited at least 1 hour between clamping. I used a bunch of clamps by Solder Shop, the sponsor of today's video. I was actually surprised by their quality, mainly by the body clamps. I've had other body clamps that were super heavy and hard to operate in the past, which basically made me not use them unless strictly necessary. But these new ones, at least new to me, from Solder, are super strong, not as heavy, and have a rubbery grip that feels comfortable and easy to crank. Their price is very appealing too, and I'm happy to recommend these to anyone who can never have too many clamps. I kept labeling the ends of the strips and making fresh cuts. Once the plywood base was covered, I assembled the SlabMatrix, an adaptable and reconfigurable router flattening sled meant for small and big wood pieces. It can be infinitely extendable, and in my case I got the 1.0 Pro version with an extension kit that I had to install since the tabletop is over 180 centimeters long. It was my first time using the SlabMatrix, and I wasn't sure where to position the long rails in relation to the workpiece. My workbench wasn't big enough, so I placed thick MDF boards under the tabletop to securely attach the rails. The parts slide really smoothly, very satisfying. This is the rail that runs across the surface and where the router will be installed. The assembly is pretty simple. All I had to do was to screw in a couple of bolts. My reading of the instructions was not the best. Okay, so basically everything that I did yesterday has to be redone. This part cannot travel all the way to the borders of the panel. I needed a bigger spacing between the rails and the workpiece, so I disassembled and reattached everything. I didn't want to buy any more material, so I used some of the plywood I got for the future cabinet as a base for the sled. I could then reattach the long rails with the correct spacing and test the sliding motion of the whole sled. Since the whole contraption is much bigger than the workbench, I needed to support the long rails to stabilize them. I grabbed a couple of scraps and attached them to each end of the rails at the correct height. If you decide that this sled is the right tool for you to flatten your slabs and large glue-up tops, Starter Shop is offering a premium quality face milling cutter with reversible blades, like this one, to anyone purchasing one of the Pro versions of the sled. This beast of a router bit is worth about 200 euros, and if you get the basic version of the sled, there's also a large 6-edged recessed router bit included. This promo is only available until the end of January using the code in the description. Please check out the link in the description for more details on how to get it for free. It was finally time to make wood chips fly. This milling bit removes an area of about 60 millimeters on each pass, which makes the overall flattening of the tabletop quite fast. I suddenly saw sparks. I knew I had hit some metal. It turned out that a broken screw was hidden inside this knot, so I had to create a dip with a chisel to grab it with a vice grip. I initially had the shop vac hooked to the SlabMatrix, but it wasn't powerful enough to catch all the chips. I swapped to the bigger dust collection and the suction improved greatly. There was still dust left behind, but the improvement was very noticeable. If you don't use dust collection at all, this kind of task will result in a massively dirty shop. Each pass took about 10 to 15 minutes, just so you get an idea of the time it takes. By the time I was done, I wished I could have a big shop with a dedicated work table with a SlabMatrix always ready to go. It was pretty fun. The cutter leaves shallow ridges, which are normal, and easily removed with an orbital sander. Once the workpiece was flat, I could trim the ends using the track saw and cut the diagonal area, which will leave near the glass door. I wanted to distance myself from perfection stress with this project, but I also didn't want to face the imperfections of the glue up every day, so I decided to cut a big bevel around the perimeter that will also hide the plywood base. I tried a 35-degree angle first, but ended up going with a 45. I was pretty happy with this choice made on the go. Since I wasn't beveling the entire edge, I had to keep a distance from the edge of the wood and the edge of the aluminum rail. This way, the plunge of the saw only starts midway into the edge of the panel. On the tabletop, there was a piece of pine that got lots of screw holes exposed after the flattening process, and I didn't like the look of it. So I tried making a few basic inlays with the router with the same pine material. I simply stuck a piece of wood with double-sided tape while aligning the router bit with imperfection. I then ran the router against the straight edge, creating elongated pockets. I measured each pocket and drew the shapes on the computer so that I could send the files to the laser and cut all the inlaid pieces. I wondered if the burned edges would be visible in the final results, and they were. So if appearance matters next time, I will cut the inlay pieces on the CNC instead. I wasn't worried about it on this tabletop because it's not a crucial furniture piece, and I saw this as a learning experience. I glued them with CA glue. I wouldn't use wood glue because the moisture makes the burning coloration soak into the fibers around it, and the staining can be a lot worse than a simple contour line like I got here. I filled the remaining upright screw holes with toothpicks or skewers and sanded everything flush. The whole tabletop was sanded up to 180 grit. I applied 2 coats of hard wax oil, first using a spreader and then smearing the finish into the surface with a soft pad on the orbital sander at the lowest speed. Once the surface got covered with the oil, I removed the excess with a few shop towels and the tabletop was complete. I will start building the cabinet to replace the sofa bed next week. Until then, Happy New Year everyone! Big thanks to Solder Shop and to my Patreon members for supporting this video. Thanks for watching and go get your hands dirty! Até para o ano!